You'll recall last time that we talked about the nuance and the subtlety of Thucydides' work as a historian, his exploration of causes, his exploration of what lies between the surface meaning of what people said, and the complex portrait that he provided of the leader of the democracy, Pericles. We're now going to turn to Thucydides' explanation of some of the worst moments in the Peloponnesian War. I think I may have hinted to you that we're reading now a historian whose mind is in some ways rather tortured by what he saw, what he experienced. And that comes out so very clearly in these descriptions of first the revolt at Mytilene and even more so the war crime that Athens committed on the island of Melos in 415 BCE, 416, 415 BCE. My guess is that you've been struggling a little bit with the prose of Thucydides, even in English translation, and the one that I chose for you is a particularly modern and fluent one. It lacks some of the dignity of the actual words of Thucydides, but I think it makes up for that in clarity. What I can share with you is that the Greek that Thucydides writes in is some of the most difficult Greek prose that one encounters. It's rather the terror of graduate students, and I remember myself that when after some years of not teaching, when I'd been involved already in a different career, I was invited back to give a lecture at the University of Freiburg on actually the revolt in Mytilene. And as I turned myself back to my beloved text of Thucydides, and it looked so very strange, I thought to myself, I should have chosen something on Herodotus instead, which is a much easier style. I'm rambling on to actually emphasize one point, that the very style of Thucydides, the jagged grammar, is in many ways a reflection of the torment that his thought brings. And I believe that's quite deliberate. In Thucydides' description of the revolution at Corcyras, he says some of the deepest and most memorable things that have ever been written about the nature of warfare, particularly the nature of a civil war. War is a harsh master or a harsh teacher. War is a stern teacher in depriving people of the power of easily satisfying their daily wants. It brings most people's minds down to the level of their actual circumstances. In other words, the exigencies of a state at war will let loose some of the worst kinds of opportunism, greed, and savagery. And in this passage, Thucydides challenges us with the way that words themselves change meaning. What used to be called thoughtless aggression becomes the courage expected of a party member. And the person who's thinking prudently of the future is accused of being a coward. A person who practices moderation is accused of an unmanly character. And understanding different perspectives, something that we prize in a free society, that becomes that describes a person who is unfit for action. Whereas fanatical enthusiasm is the mark of a real man, and plotting behind an enemy's back is no longer seen as treachery, but actually legitimate self-defense. And violent opinions, the person with the loudest, angriest, meanest opinions, becomes the person who is considered trustworthy. And in a reversal of all the sorts of things that any society would prize, we find him saying, family relations were weaker than party membership, since party members were more likely to go to any extreme for any reason whatever. Those of you familiar with the history of the Soviet Union will find a sort of eerie similarity to things that happened, especially during the era of Stalin. And Thucydides also tells us that in professing to serve the public interest, they were seeking to win the prizes for themselves, self-interest triumphing over public interest. And again, these things sound all too familiar. Remember that Thucydides told us right at the beginning he was writing a katema sia, something, a possession for all times. And his voice is one that is speaking to us as much as it was speaking to the ancient Greeks. He warns that the horrors, the atrocities that we're seeing in the revolution at Corcyra are things that happen and always will happen while human nature is what it is. Once again, he is not just chronicling the events of the Peloponnesian War, as great and as important as a moment in history as that was, but he's telling us what we can predict based on what human behavior has been. And he points out that there was a general degeneration, a general deterioration of character throughout the Greek world. And again, as he points out the nature of behavior in such circumstances, with the ordinary conventions of human life thrown into confusion, human nature, always ready to offend, even where laws exist, showed itself proudly in its true colors as something incapable of controlling passion, insubordinate to the idea of justice. And the acts of revenge. Indeed, it is true that in these acts of revenge on others, men take it upon themselves to begin the process of repealing those general laws of humanity, which are there to give a hope of salvation to all who are in distress, instead of leaving those laws in existence, remembering that there may come a time when they too will be in danger and will need their protection. Remember that Thucydides, when he described the plague of Athens in the second book, mentioned in passing that he himself had suffered from the plague. There is something in the way he writes history that does remind me of a physician who is very much in possession of himself, who's objective and analyzes and diagnoses, in this case that we're reading now, the ills of society, the weaknesses in human nature in the instance of the plague. Thucydides had the ability to describe in great detail all of the things that he and his fellow citizens had endured. What we're going to look at next, a passage that you read in Thucydides, describes the revolt in Mytilene, which is the major city on the island of Lesbos, and the debate at Athens over what the fate should be of the insurrection after they had subdued the city and taken captives. I just provided you here with a picture of, in fact, the old theater, which was built over by the Romans to be used as an arena, but just to give you a sense of the archaeological monuments on this absolutely magnificent island of Lesbos. Mytilene was part of the Athenian alliance, otherwise known as the Athenian Empire, by the time we come to the Peloponnesian War. It had a special status in that it didn't pay tribute in silver, but had its own fleet. It contributed ships to the Athenian navy. It had an oligarchic government which was inclined towards Sparta. Sparta itself was an oligarchy, unlike the democracy at Athens. And the government of Mytilene wanted to unify the whole island of Lesbos under its rule, including another very large city of Methymna. Although Sparta had demurred on an earlier request that the Mytileneans made to essentially get aid so they could revolt against Athens, in the year 428, Sparta actually, along with its ally Boeotia, helped to plan the revolt. There was first a skirmish and then some negotiations between Mytilene and Athens. Both the skirmish and the negotiations were inconclusive. Then the Athenians, using their very powerful navy, blockaded the harbor. Sparta delayed in sending help, And while they were essentially wondering, when and how strong a navy they should send, Mytilene falls. A Spartan general who was there in the city was captured, sent to Athens, and executed. The Athenians were furious. 428 was not long after the high point of the plague. The plague was still an issue in Athens. And the Athenian assembly voted to kill every man in the city and to sell all the women and children into slavery. To understand how all this came about, aside from the context of Athens still in the throes of the plague and no longer having the wise and more moderate leadership of Pericles, we need to understand the historical figure of Cleon. Cleon is identified by the Greeks as a demagogue. What does that term mean? It literally means somebody who leads the people. And in fact, being a demagogue in Athens was, in fact, not a particularly anti-democratic thing to do. It did not always have the same pejorative connotations that it now does. When we talk about a demagogue, it is invariably somebody that we regard as a opportunistic rabble-rouser. Whereas in the Athenian democracy, the demagogues were people who could persuade the people, and that was part of the democratic process. Cleon had opposed Pericles and actually was successful in getting him out of office in 430. Remember, Pericles is voted out, he's fined, and then he comes back into office, something that one might see, contrary to what Plato said, as a sign of a healthy democracy. It realized its mistake and set things right. But Pericles died shortly after that, and that left a vacuum into which Cleon, a forceful, bullying, violent speaker, could move. It was Cleon who led the movement to exile Thucydides, arguing that he had shown poor performance as a general. To be honest, as one looks at the history, Cleon does get something of a bad rap from Thucydides, who did have a grudge against him, for obvious reasons, and the case could certainly be made that Thucydides was treated quite unfairly. But it's incontrovertible that Cleon was a manipulative and opportunistic leader. He didn't like the way he was portrayed, or I should say rather the city of Athens was portrayed by the comic poet Aristophanes in a lost play. We only know a little bit about it, called The Babylonians. In 427, Aristophanes won first prize, so the Athenians clearly liked it. And he appeared to have been taking aim at Athens' imperialism by showing its allies as slaves grinding away at a mill. Aristophanes is a great example of how free the intellectual was, how free the discourse was in Athens. But Cleon didn't want to have anything of that, so he tried to prosecute Aristophanes on charges of diminishing and defaming the Republic. He didn't get anywhere with that. And Aristophanes then just kept at Cleon devastatingly in a play in 424 called The Knights. He shows Cleon as some boorish sausage seller. And it was not in any way infrequent for the comic poets to take aim at authority figures this way. And again, a sign of just how vibrant the freedom of speech was in ancient Athens. It's safe to say that Cleon was a populist. That's to say, he wanted to flatter the Athenian people and to present himself as their guardian, hence going after Thucydides. And he hated the aristocracy and of course that was a good populist position. He could present them as the enemies of the people. He was rather responsible for persuading the assembly not to take a very favorable peace with Sparta in 425. And as you know from the history of the Peloponnesian War, Athens ultimately would pay a dear price for missing that opportunity. And of course, as you'll see in the Mitylenean debate, he really liked the idea of punishing anybody who in any way weakened the Athenian empire. Thucydides records the debate over the fate of Mitylene in great detail. It's one of the most important passages in Thucydides' history, and I should say in history, full stop. The Athenians were frightened by the possibility of other revolts, and as I mentioned before, they voted in hot haste and hot temper to kill all the men in the city, enslave the women and children. And a trireme is dispatched to the troops on the island of Lesbos to do that. But the assembly had regrets the next day and wanted to reconsider. Cleon was enraged at the possible change of heart, and he bullies the assembly that they shouldn't indulge in debate, but follow their leaders. Cleon says that the Athenians should be unbiased judges rather than competitors, because then they are more likely to get things right. Cleon argued that speakers ought to stop being carried away by cleverness and a contest of intelligence. In other words, he's being blatantly anti-intellectual, and he's pushing back against the freedom that the assembly had to reconsider and to weigh things again in a different light. It's very interesting in this passage. You'll see how often the language of contest comes up. Cleon is suggesting that there should be no contesting of opinions, that people should just listen to the speeches, be unbiased judges, and to stick with it. Thucydides, who argues against that, is much more open to the spirit of Athens. It is necessary for a good citizen not to frighten those who speak against him, but to prove his case in fair argument. That is such an important point to recognize, that it was part of the Athenian mindset to hash things out in free debate and free discussion. Before I leave Cleon, I want to read you a few more of his words. He says, "This is the very worst thing, to pass measures and then not abide by them. We should realize that a city is better off with bad laws, so long as they remain fixed, than with good laws that are constantly being altered. That lack of learning combined with sound common sense is more helpful than the kind of cleverness that gets out of hand." In other words, a kind of safety and mediocrity. They're better governed by the man in the street than by intellectuals. And then he goes on to say, "People who are not so confident in their own intelligence are prepared to admit that the laws are wiser than they are, and that they lack the ability to pull to pieces a speech made by a good speaker. They are unbiased judges and not people taking part in some kind of competition. So things go well when they are in control. We statesmen, too, should try to be like them instead of being carried away by mere cleverness." So there is a kind of a know-nothing anti-intellectualism about all of this, combined, of course, with a brutal instinct towards those who cross Athens, and particularly that cross Cleon's view of how Athens should behave. Thucydides is much more measured. He does not argue from sentiment or even from kindness. He argues from practicality, that if Athens makes an example out of Mitylene by killing every man in the city and selling the women and children into slavery, basically wiping it out, then what kind of inducement do they give to other cities that might revolt and then think better of it? They may as well stick to it all the way to the bloody end, because the Athenians have shown that even when a city surrenders, they're going to deal with it in the harshest of ways. And the Athenians vote again, and they vote in favor of mercy and lenience. Punish only the ringleaders, not the whole city. And so a second trireme is dispatched. It has two crews on board so they can row all the time. They don't have to rest. And they arrive just in time to counter this horrifying order. Even before we get to the well-known, the notorious siege and sack of Melos, I want to mention that the Athenians did not stick to that ethic of mercy or even pragmatism that they showed in the Middle Aenean debate. In 421, after they managed to defeat the rebellion at Scione, they did indeed kill every man in the city and sell all the women and children into slavery. So we're beginning to see in the Athenians a brutality that really rather belies the glorious words of Pericles in the second book when he talked about how moderately the Athenians had ruled their empire. And I don't mean to let the Spartans off the hook either. After the siege of Plataea, they treated the people of Plataea with ultimate brutality. Plataea, which had stood with Athens in 490 BCE against the Persians on the field of Marathon, was a neutral city, but the Thebans tried by surprise to take it over early in the Peloponnesian War, and the Plataeans successfully resisted that. The Thebans, who were allies of the Spartans, brought pressure to bear, and Sparta besieged the city, a siege that lasted for a couple of years. And when the siege was finally successful and Plataea capitulated, the Spartans took each one of the Plataean men before them and asked them this question: have you done anything to help the Spartans and their allies in the war? As each man replied, no, he was taken away and put to death. No exceptions made. So, in terms of atrocities during the war, one needs to recognize that there was tremendous blame to go around on all sides. But now we come to the Melian dialogue, very, very important part of Thucydides, one of those places where we confront the idea of realism in public policy. Melos was an unaligned state, neither part of the Spartan alliance nor the Athenian alliance, and it refused to submit to Athens. Athens had resented its independence in the Aegean world because every other island there was a tributary of Athens, and began to raid its territory in 426, and then demanded a tribute of 15 talents every year. Then waiting until there was a truce with Sparta, so Athens was not worried about fighting the war with its major enemy, it laid siege to Melos. Melos surrendered, and Athens did indeed kill all the men in the city, and they sold the women and children into slavery. Notice that Euripides' play, The Trojan War, was staged very shortly after this atrocity at Melos, and it's hard to imagine that that was not on the mind of Euripides as he wrote The Trojan Women, which you saw at least in part in video, and certainly on the minds of the Athenians. And it remained on their minds when in 404 BCE, Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War and the Spartans sailed into the Piraeus. Sparta's allies, namely Corinth and Thebes, had urged them to do the same thing to Athens, to kill all the men in the city, sell the women and children to slavery, raise the walls, wipe it out from existence. What makes this particular passage so important in understanding both the Peloponnesian War and Thucydides' view of history is a remarkable dialogue that Thucydides writes. Clearly, it had to be more or less reconstructed. It's as much, I shouldn't say as much, but it is partly literary in addition to being historical. The Athenians don't waste any time justifying their empire. And they say that, we're not going to go over all the good reasons why we deserve an empire. And they're not interested in the fact that Milos is neutral. They dive right in and say practical people recognize that justice depends on equality of power. Otherwise, the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. It's a ruthless justification of the rule of the strong over the weak. And the Melians counter that there is such a thing as fair play. And in a rather prophetic way, at least the way Thucydides represents this, say, your own fall would be visited by the most terrible vengeance and would be an example to the world. And that almost happened. It was the Spartan sense of restraint that kept Athens from being wiped out from memory. The Athenians say they don't want to look weak in the Aegean world. And so it would be good for Athens, be good for Milos if they just surrendered. In other words, it would just go easier for them if they capitulate. Milos warns, interestingly enough, the hostility that Athens' actions would cause. If neutral states see that this is the way Athens treats another neutral party, that might really persuade them to go with the Spartans. And they say that we refuse to show such cowardice as to capitulate. And Milos rather poignantly invokes the gods that they stand for what is right. Athens counters. It's the law of nature to rule wherever they can, so they're not worried about what the gods might think. Milos expresses its hope that Sparta will help. They were originally founded by the Spartans way back when. Athens notes that the Spartans tend to be rather slow to help anybody, that they don't tend to get involved, they don't move quickly, and that, of course, is true. So the discussion ends, the war begins, and in 415, the terrible fate of Milos is that the men are indeed killed and the women and children sold into slavery. Thucydides, as I mentioned earlier, wrote his history of the Peloponnesian War to be a possession for all times. He talks regularly about the way that human nature will always cause certain things to happen under particular circumstances. This caused me to reflect a little bit about what history is, what history does for us. We didn't study this, or I should say I didn't assign this to you simply because it's an interesting thing to read from long ago. It is a book with an urgent message, and history is an urgent topic because, as Collingwood had pointed out, I think I quoted this for you earlier, it's a way that we can use the past to understand the present in which we are called to act. And I ask each one of you throughout this course, and indeed throughout your lives, to look in a mirror and ask yourselves, how will history judge us? How will it judge us for the parts we play, large and small, in the arena in which we are called to play? And I quoted for you Collingwood's line, the value of history is that it teaches us what man has done and what man is. In other words, who will we be in the light of history? And I couldn't help but evoking one of my favorite musicians, now sadly dead. He died in 2019, the South African Johnny Clegg. However much you seek to solve this mystery, no one ignores the iron vice of history. Well, we are always, every day, engaged in things that will one day become part of history. We want to learn from the past. We want to see what's happened in particular circumstances, to judge our circumstances by that historical experience, and to make wise and prudent decisions that will make us the kind of actors in history that we will be proud to be.